Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome back to the chess opening series, EVANS Gambit. This is the part 2. Those who haven't seen the part 1, we covered the accepted variation of EVANS Gambit. Today we are going to do the same, but with a bishop c5 line instead of bishop a5. So, well, as you already know, EVANS Gambit starts with e4 and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, black plays bishop c5, and then we can play b4, the start of Ivan's gambit. Now, bishop takes b4. Uh, the decline and other variations will be covered on the separate videos, as I have mentioned before. c3, here we have already covered what will happen on bishop to a5. Now we will see what will happen on bishop to c5. Now, practically, this is not a good idea. Because it allows white to play pawn to d4 with a tempo on the bishop, right? But theoretically, it has been played a lot of times, and you can actually play this if you know what I mean. If you are a black player of e4, e5, then you can also take away how to tackle the Ivan's gambit from black side if you want to play bishop to c5 line. It is not as bad as it looks actually. So d4 by white. Of course, we have to strike in the center. E takes d4, and so, well, Ivan's gambit is a true gambit, so we are not going to capture it back. Otherwise, bishop b4 check or something. So we're just gonna cast. So far, it is absolute the main line. Here, black has variety of options they can play. They can play pawn to d6, knight to f6, knight to e7, even bishop to b6, which transposes to d6. But more or less, the main idea is pawn to d6. You cannot really capture the pawn. If you capture the pawn on c3, well, amongst many other moves like simple knight c3, we can also play bishop f7. And I think this one is a nice compensation because check, you have to play king f8 or king e8, doesn't matter. Queen c5 check, d6, queen takes c3. And let's say one more move, knight f6, we just play bishop to b2, and you can already sense that white is just better. This king is not castle, so this rook cannot come into the game. If you want this rook to come into the game, you have to play king f7 and move the rook. But when you step on f7, I have knight g5, so you have to play h6, then king f7, and then move the rook. So if you play h6, let's say knight bd2, king f7, well, amongst many other moves, simple queen b3 check, covers the pawn back. There is a disgusting ancient line after bishop e6. I mean, I'm going to spare that line because that line starts with bishop f6. You can find it out yourself, but I will just suggest you to capture the pawn on b7. It's more human. There's nothing wrong with it. You attack the knight also, so you have to play queen d7. Now we capture the knight because rook b8 was a threat to take the bishop. So now it makes a lot of sense. Black can just go before capturing rook b8. We just play queen e6. Uh, G takes f6 looks horrible pawn structure for black, so you might as well take with the king. There is no real danger to the king right now, but let's say simple move like rook a to c1, attacking the knight, pressuring the c7 point. You can already sense that white has to be better. White has both knights very pretty fairly well placed. Knight on c6 will move. I will play knight d4 next. I will play f4, get f5 or e5, and white is definitely preferred in this position. So yeah, this is better for white. So dc3 not a good idea for black. You cannot ignore your development. Now, if you play, let's say, knight f6 is definitely a blunder because we just take c takes d4. Now let's say you play bishop b6, then I just go e5, knight g4. Amongst many other moves, bishop takes f7 works because after king takes, we have knight g5 check, king f8, queen takes, and the main idea being you cannot take this pawn, trap the rook, because if you take the pawn, well, there comes queen f4 check, and it's time to resign. So that is possible amongst many other moves. So knight f6, plainly a bad idea. Let's see what will happen on 97. It doesn't look that bad, but kinda is, because your pieces are just not that well placed. After c takes d4, simply bishop to b6. And okay, there are a few games in this position, but one which I really like is knight g5 move, because now if you castle, which is a blunder, then I have simple queen h5. There is too much pressure on these two pawns. You cannot defend against everything, so you're dead lost. So you have to play more or less d5. But then I just take, and if you take it back, that's bad. Remember that fried liver attack that white plays on knight f second, two knights defense, that white plays knight g5 and then knight f7 if d5 cd ed knight d5 played. We have the superior version of the fried liver attack, because our king is castled, e file is open. This is just lost after king takes queen h5. Queen f3 is possible. Queen h5 is even more precise. And yeah, you're lost. g6, bishop takes d5 check. King e6, rook e1 check. Well, you have to choose your poison, as they say. But yeah, that's lost. So you cannot take the pawn. Might as well play knight a5. And this is the theme of the position. Abdul Sataro actually had one of the games which we are going to cover on that d6 line. Similar idea, similar position, but uh, but different move order. So we'll see that also. But here the main idea being, you don't really need to move the bishop. You can counter attack the knight. Idea being, if you capture on c4, which is your only move, then we don't capture on e7. We play queen a4 check, and this is the problem. This is hanging. This is hanging. The king is under check, and you cannot defend everything. Let's say you play knight f6, so you get one knight out of the out of the attack. But when the knight leaves the e file, we have rook e1 check. We can capture the knight later, right? And let's say you play bishop e6. Here, before capturing the knight, we can just take on e6 and take on e6 again, and then take on c4. So materially, it is more or less equal, but black king is busted. And even if you play something like rook e8, you try to take advantage of back rank, doesn't matter, d5, and that's it. You can resign. Basically, it is plus 2.5 or something for white. And it's not like you have to play absolute best moves to convert this. For example, if black takes on d6, you just naturally develop the bishop on a3. Naturally develop the knight on c3, get the rook on e8 or c8, sorry, e1 or c1. Yeah, so that's it. A very natural development, and uh, white is winning. So this knight e7 is not a very ambitious way to play. Okay, that brings us back to the move d6. Now, if you play bishop b6, then I just take the pawn and you have to play d6. So that transposes. So d6, we takes the pawn and bishop d6. Okay. Now, in this position, white already has like 68, which has been played on this position. Just because white is down only one pawn, white has entire center, and white already have piece development, and black still needs to figure out what to do with this bishop and this knight, and especially that bishop. If you have seen the part 1 of this series, then you know that our compensation lies in the center piece activity and that c8 bishop. That's gonna be a problem piece. Hence, the move I'm going to suggest is a very rare move, and something which will definitely take your opponent out of the opening. And the move is h3. A rare move, very less played move, but it makes so much sense. I cannot just, I mean, even if it's not the best move according to the engine, it gives white a sufficient advantage. h3, with the simple idea of avoiding this bishop from deploying itself to the g4 square. And I mean, you cannot play that, of course. That is defended. You cannot really go to e6, d5 will come, and d7 is not particularly a great square for your bishop either. So what we are doing is we are just playing against that bishop for the rest of the game. How? Well, let's see. Um, well, you basically have two moves in this position. You have to castle, right? So knight e7 and knight f6 makes sense to me. If you play knight to e7, then we will go to the very similar idea. And this is actually the game of Abdusattorov, which I was mentioning, knight g5. And yeah, again, if you castle queen h5 means the game on the spot. So d5 was played in his game. And after e takes d, knight a5, you already know knight takes d5, knight f7 wins. So knight a5. Uh, Abdusattorov played this game against a 2500 rated player, a grandmaster, and he just won right out of the opening. He did play d6, which is the best continuation. This is a continuation which you have to remember whenever your opponent plays knight e7. You go knight g5, and you always have this d5, e takes d, and d6 idea. Idea being, whenever you take on c4, which is forced, otherwise I take on f7, then you go queen a4 check, and that is about it. c6, then I take the knight, attacks the queen, and then I take the knight. And if you play knight c6, which was played in the game, remember this is a classical game. Here Abdusattorov played rook e1 check, and after bishop e6 he blundered with queen takes c4 and had a very tough time winning this game. He was basically lost. But here, the simplest idea, knight e6 wins, and after pawn takes, rook takes, king d7, queen takes c4. I have already shown you what will happen on rook to e8. Then you can just play d5, and if you may try knight a5, which is a blunder, but you may think that okay, the rook is under attack, the queen is under attack, queen cannot really defend this rook here, but I can just go queen d5. If you play c6, I will just transfer my queen to f5, and then I will have rook e7 double check. That will end the game on the spot. So yeah, this is not the way to continue. That would just lose you the game. So Abdusattorov missed this chance in the game and had a very tough time winning it, but he did able to win the game at the end. So knight to e7, definitely a bad move. Knight g5 immediately exploits it. Knight to f6 makes more sense in this position. Okay. I will come back to this position. There is actually one move which you can actually try, which is the best move according to the engines, but it is basically only played handful of times. And all those players are like either very low rated and they just move the same piece twice in opening, or they are just, the engine players. I mean the correspondence games. So the engines moves. So knight f6, more human move. Let's cover this one first. Okay, on knight f6, I will suggest you to just play knight c3. Why not? We just develop a knight and defends the pawn. Now, basically, two moves are possible. One, which is playable, but it is inhuman, and no one have ever played this move. And two, which is the most played move in this position, and basically everyone has played this move. So the one move which everyone has played is castles. Why not? Yeah, it is basically the most played, only played move in this position. But it basically loses. Bishop to g5. And there is very little you can do about bishop knight coming to d5. One game I found was played in 1851 between the legend and Adolf Anderson, who played the very first Immortal game and also the Evergreen game. So a legend himself, versus Jonathan Lowenthal, who was also a legend of his own. So this game was played in 1851, as I mentioned. H6 was played, and simple bishop h4, knight d5 is still coming in. And here, well, with the lack of better defense, black played g5, but you already know what you can do. Just sack the knight. takes knight d5 being a huge threat, so bishop d4 is more or less forced. Then white plays knight d5 again. You don't really care about that rook. If you play bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, and you lose that knight, too many attackers there. So you cannot really do that. Bishop e6 played. And a beautiful idea by white, and one that you have to be very mindful of when you play EVANS Gambit, rook b1. I'm going to use this idea in other lines as well. The idea is I'm trying to rook lift to this or this square. And my favorite way to develop a rook is a rook lift. So you will see a lot of rook lifts in my suggestions. So yeah, rook b1 and rook b8 played by black. Pawn was also hanging, but at this point you cannot really count pawns. Well, rook to b3, and that's about it. Let's say you play king h7. Here, white played bishop f6 simply, and after bishop f6, queen h5 check. And after king g8, well, knight f6 was played, but you can also play rook g3 check. And after take, bishop g7, queen h6 is game over. But in the game, knight f6 check was played, and here, well, Lothenthal resigned the game because rook g3 check is coming up next. You have to give up a queen. You got no compensation for it. Okay, now going back to this position. Here, I told you that the most obvious move and the most played move was castle, which more or less loses to bishop g5. The best move in this position is bishop to a5. Now, for some of you, it may make sense. For some of you, it wouldn't. Because why are you at... Well, while it does attack the knight which defends the pawn, are you actually capturing the central pawn? Because I will play knight d5. You can't take the knight and you can't take the pawn. Let's see why. If you take the pawn on e4, then yes, the bishop is defending the e1 square. Not really. Rook to e1. We are playing for the king. Bishop takes e1, queen takes e1, and if you don't want to lose the knight, you have to play something like f5, when white can just rapid develop with bishop g5. Queen is more or less forced to play queen d7, and well, as you can see, if you castle here, you will be directly under my bishop. You cannot play knight a5 to harass my bishop because that is defended, and your knight here is pinned, can't move it. Your bishop cannot move because the queen is there. Queen cannot move because c7 is hanging. This is borderline zugzwang, and one simple move like knight d2 and the game is basically decided. No defense against knight e4 and simple queen e4 when the king will be on hunt. And this is what we like. That's why we play EVANS Gambit, right? So it is actually +3, +4 for white, even though white is down in exchange and couple of pawns. This is the power of EVANS Gambit. You cannot just defend the e1 square and be like, okay, rook is not coming to e1, but it does. And if you take on d5, of course you take with the pawn because we want to open the e file, right? It's not just that. Actually, knight e7, queen a4 check is more or less forces black to play c6. Otherwise, I'm attacking the bishop and the king. c6 defends the bishop. We take the pawn. We are threatening to, well, take further. So you take it back and we will play d5. Very simple and nice chess. And after castles, we just take. And if you see this position, we are not even down a pawn. We have a passed pawn on c6 square. Our pieces are much more unified. And I mean, let's say you play d5. Then we play bishop to d3. And let's say one sample line goes like knight g6. Then you just go bishop g5, f6, and come back bishop e3. We have so much control over that d4 square. Knight is landing there for sure. Rook will support the pawn on c file. This rook will come to e file, support that square when this bishop moves. Otherwise, we just put the rook on d1, attack this pawn. White's ideas are very natural, free-flowing. White is not even down a pawn. So this is just on your strength if you can win this or not. but white is completely winning in this position. Okay, so that is what happens on knight takes d5, and more or less forced. Pawn takes, queen a4, c6 is forced, we take on c6, take back is forced, d5, then you have to castle, and then everything else falls into the place. Now, if you castle well, then you directly falls into bishop g5, and I don't even have to say anything. This is a internal pin, and I'm going to take play bishop s6. You are dead lost. So that is not how you can play this. One move you could probably try is h6. Now, I'm going to suggest something very funny and very funky in this position from white side. This is very much a opening theory. So, I mean, no game has been played. It's a novelty territory. This bishop a5 itself is a novelty. But this is the best move. And I'm going to suggest you a very beautiful idea. Remember I told you the rook lifts are my favorite thing. I'm going to suggest you knight takes f6, queen takes f6 and a4. With a very funky idea of rook a3 and rook g3. And believe it or not, it is actually the best move. And after, let's say, you castles rook a3, it is borderline zugzwang again, because let's say you play bishop d7, you want to develop a bishop. I'm just gonna put my bishop back. I'm not doing much. My bishop on c1 is pretty much developed. I can put it on b2 if I have a future plan of e5. Otherwise, I'm just gonna keep it there. And it is very hard to make a move. Let's say you play rook e8. Now, suddenly you fall into e5. Idea is, after you take the pawn, I take it with the knight. So you cannot really take back with the knight, because after pawn takes is a double attack on the bishop and the queen. And if you don't take it back, d7 is hanging and f7 is hanging. So, well, you play bishop to e6. That's the only way to defend both. But, well, that's a very sneaky rook, you see. Rook to f3 and you're dead lost. Queen e7 is more or less forced. Then we play rook takes f7. The rook. And yeah, after bishop takes, you are basically forced to resign. King h7, queen d3 will lead to mate. King h8, knight g6 leads to, well, mate also, but we will also win the queen. And if you play king f8, do we take the rook? Nope. We just play bishop a2. And queen f3 is coming up next. Queen h5 is coming up next. Bishop a3 is coming up next. There's no defense. You cannot really defend anything. And also there is knight g6 amongst every other threat. That's also direct mate. So yeah, one sample line just goes on to show some funky ideas of EVANS Gambit, especially this pawn to a4 push. I really love this pawn to a4 move. Not only on this position, but majority of the positions which we are going to cover. This pawn to a4 and rook a3, or sometimes rook b1 to rook b3. Okay, that's what happened when you play bishop to a5, the best move recommended by the engines. Otherwise, you are just lost. Okay, now going back to this position. I told you the most human moves are knight e7 and knight f6, which are exclusively played, and white has a huge result. I mean, it is kind of obvious why. Because of the lines we saw, right? Now in this position, there is one move which black can actually try, and the move is knight to a5. A good move. It is played handful of time, as I said before, and never on a top level. So it is. I mean, this. If your opponent knows this move, then well, he is very well prepared. But against that h3 variation, which is a side variation. Okay, but I have to show you what is the best line against it. Well, we value our bishop. We don't really want to give it up. Bishop d3. Now, knight putting it on f6, then directly steps into e5. So we have to put it on e7. For one pawn, white already has quite a good compensation. We have a full center, better king, well, a worse pieces for black. So it is already a full compensation. But let me give you a sample line. knight c3, castles, and you already know me. I love rook lifts. Yes, this time there are a lot of pieces on the third rank, so we cannot really put it on a3 and swing it over. But I have another idea. And thankfully, engine approved this idea. And the idea is rook b1. And believe it or not, let's say if you play knight g6, I have the idea of rook b5. This is incredibly tricky. Here the best move is c5, so you cut my rook so I cannot go to h5. But if you play, let's say, bishop d7 or c6 or any other moves, I'm just gonna move it to h5. And do you see the threat? So let's say black play knight c6. Do you see a threat in this position? Why the rook is on h5? Yep. Rook takes h7. And king h7, knight g5 leads to quick checkmate. So that is very hard to defend. After rook h5, the threat is very simple, rook h7. And if you play h6, well, we don't really care. Bishop takes h6. And after pawn takes, we don't take with the rook, of course. We play queen d2 or queen c1. Queen s6 is unstoppable. That will lead to mate again. Only one of the variation goes on to show how easy it is to get checkmate in EVANS Gambit. And also this rook lift. I really love this one. Okay, if your opponent does play c5, then you have to play e5. And if you take on e5, I take on c5, and we basically trade out pawns where white is somewhat better. Let's say you play bishop c7, and one more accurate move is needed, rook b2, because your opponent would play bishop to d7 to c6 with tempo on the rook, and rook is no longer needed on b5. So rook b2, so the rook is no longer needed on b5. So rook b2. Now the idea amongst other is rook d2, just doubling on very funny way. I mean, let's say you play bishop e6, then okay, I have knight g5 now, so you don't really play bishop e6. Let's say you play h6 before you play bishop e6. Now I play rook d2, bishop g6 being a threat, so you play queen e7. And whenever the queen goes to e7, I can always play knight d5, but I can also take on g6 first, play knight d5, and you can already sense that white got more than enough compensation. Let's say queen f7. This is all the best moves from black side, by the way. So your opponent has to play really precise to get this position, where after rook d6, now g6 is hanging, e5 is hanging, and basically we peter out into a drawn position, which is still somewhat better for white, and you definitely prefer this for white side. Okay, so that's what happened on knight to a5. We play simple bishop d3, we develop the knight on c3, we put the rook on b1, maybe b5 and h5 with a quick win. So yeah, this is how you play from black side. Knight a5 is a very strong line. It makes very little sense, but it is kind of equalizing if you play it well. And black is solid, what I can say. But we have enough tricks to keep the game going. Okay, so that's gonna wrap up the bishop c5 variation of EVANS Gambit. And this is the conclusion of part 2. And I will see you on the part 3 with bishop to e7. Till then, take care. Bye.